Our final lecture over Marx Communist philosophy concerns the discussion of one of his most famous philosophical social political work. That is his Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto continues to serve as the foundation for the communist movement. The manifesto was in part a response to Hegel's absolute idealism and Marx's own explanation as to why, in the end, Hegel got it wrong in understanding human nature and the nature of reality itself. That is, Marx expressed and continued to explore the ideas put forward by Feuerbach and similar philosophers, that our ideas change with the conditions of our material existence, not the other way around. And thus, what we call truth is merely the result of the material conditions that exist in society in that point in history. Recall that Marx identified 5 primary epochs of history: the primitive communal epoch, the epoch most represented by slavery, that is, the empire period of history, the feudal period of history marked out by monarchies and the burgeoning church, the capitalist epoch of history within which we are now immersed, and of course the coming communist epoch of history. Marx points out that the continual concentration of capital leads to a continual devaluing of labor. And we saw this in his critique of capitalism and his analysis of free market economics. That is, as labor production becomes more efficient, less work and fewer workers are required, and thus the workers, the so-called proletariat, become less valuable and less called for. In the manifesto, Marx goes on to discuss the relationship between the middle-class bourgeoisie and the proletariat, that is, the working class. He points out that history has always been one of class struggle. And note that by the time we get to the capitalist period of history, that struggle is represented by now and reduced to now 2 classes, that of capitalists and that of labor. Modern industry now establishes the modern world markets. Development of labor class leads to a revolutionary class as predicted by Marx. The bourgeois destroys older classes and professions. That is, it is through the management of production for the sake of the capitalist that the cottage industries and artisans are replaced by factory-made products that are made cheaper and thus more attractive to anyone participating in the capitalist free market system. In order to continually develop our surplus value, the capitalist continues to seek new modes of production to increase that capital, that is, those technologies. Marx predicts in the Manifesto this inevitably leads to the proletariat revolution. After all, as more and more workers are out of work, out of jobs because of technology's efficiencies, there will be a rising sense of frustration because of the alienation from one's productive life, and also the continual reduction in participation in the free market system. That is, the continued loss of income, the continued divide between the wealthy capitalists that continue to pool the wealth of production for their own purposes and the working class that continues to fall deeper and deeper into poverty. The proletariat will eventually turn to the communist worker program that is a program that represents workers as a whole, eventually leaving behind unions or nationalities in favor of reflecting the interests of the basic working class, not worrying about where those workers are or whether they are unionized or not. The abolition of property, in particular the means of production, is the communist goal. This is the final movement in history. This is the abolition of bourgeoisie property. That is the notion of private property that encourages individualism over the needs of the community and the value of the worker itself. Labor creates no property, but only capital. And this capital then pools in the hands of the capitalists. This creates an inevitable antagonism between capital and wage that in itself creates property. That is the need for saying, this is mine and not yours. Bourgeois ideals of freedom are only understood in comparison to the previous feudal epoch. But this notion of freedom has no meaning for the proletariat. This is the notion of an exclusive sense of freedom, that is, the individual freedom of not being interfered with by others, sort of libertarianism, as opposed to the inclusive sense of freedom in which we have not only freedom to not be interfered with, but also freedom to expect adequate housing, adequate food, adequate education as part of what's required to say, I'm free. Social norms are turned into laws of nature and reason. And Marx, and even more precisely from Engels, argues for the abolition of the traditional family, arguing that today's traditional family is more a unit of capital than it is a natural part of reality. The whole point of the traditional family is that it allows for the reduction of our children and wives into producers for the sake of the capitalists by the bourgeoisie. The abolition of wives destroys public and private prostitution in the sense that the notion that prostitution, first and foremost, competes with the traditional marriage and family obligations. The notion of nations is a bourgeois tool to protect the accumulated wealth of the capitalist. Through social and communist literature, the aristocratic pamphlets against the bourgeois replace political action. Marx points out that this kind of literature ignores history in favor of defending the capitalist status quo and the continued accumulation of wealth by the capitalists. Christianity is regarded as a defender of the capitalism and the development of new aristocracies. Note how in today's industrialized world, Christianity first and foremost defends the status quo and is most associated with the so-called conservative movement that is in league to prevent more progressive ideas in favor of the worker. Petty bourgeois socialism, that is, the continued praise of small business against large corporations, has as its goal only the return to feudalism and is often seen more as a palliative response to the evils of capitalism rather than progress forward. Marx goes on to point out that German true socialism merely demands practical reason without the attendant social condition. That is, the translation of the ancient values of morality into a justification by reason. However, it does not submit to or encourage social change. Socialism is threatened by bourgeois concentration of capital for the sake of the capitalist and the proletariat masses. Bourgeois socialism, social reforms within the capitalist structure, consider that socialist programs often are intended to moderate and ameliorate the concerns of the working class in order to maintain the general capitalist economic system. Communist writings only anticipated the revolution, but material conditions had not progressed enough. That is, again, as was mentioned earlier, Marx's own reluctance to discuss the material conditions in anticipation of communism. And finally, such early attempts fail but contain the seeds of revolution. As socialism continues to gain a footing, this moderate regulation of the worst evils of capitalism contain the seeds for the desire to eventually overturn capitalism and its reduction of the human being into a mere productive object. Communists and other opposition movements should all be supported in order to bring down capitalism in anticipation of the ascendancy of communism. That is, in this pamphlet, Marx is not only describing what the eventual next epoch will look like, but also is supporting the radical movements that will bring about the final epoch of history. As we finally have an opportunity to get the overall view of Marx's communist ideas, we should ask whether Marx is correct in his analysis of human nature. Is it the case that fundamentally human beings are first and foremost producers and as the source of value understand themselves through their work? Perhaps it is the case that first and foremost humans are the creators of reason, and value comes from the exercise of reason over the material nature of our reality. And thus, reason is the fundamental explanation of human nature. Is his understanding of the complex nature of the free market, innovation, and capitalism correct? Is his analysis of labor production, labor value, the correct understanding of how the free market works? Is it not possible that the innovation of new technologies and the expansion of capitalist wealth is not is a source for the rising of all boats? That is, as the capitalist expands material wealth, is it not true that even the working class is able to participate and experience the expansion of that wealth? Is his reality of material substructure true? Is it the case that reality is produced by the material substructure of that point in history, that is the means of production and the class structure that entails? Or is the Hegelian understanding of reality closer to the truth, in which reality is the product of the mind and the spirit and the ideas that the mind and the spirit create? Perhaps the most important source of evaluation of communist ideas comes from the empirical evidence per se. That is there empirical evidence to show that capitalism is unstable, unreliable, and eventually must give way to a different understanding of capital and the social relationships of production? Already, we can see that the divide between worker and owner continues to widen as the basic wage of workers has not expanded relative to inflation for more than 40 years. And even the divide of wealth between the industrialized northern hemisphere and the so-called third world nations of the Southern Hemisphere continues to widen. That is, those who are born in the Southern Hemisphere are far more likely to continue an existence and hand down for their inheritors an existence of bare subsistence poverty, while inhabitants of the northern industrialized nations continue to increase their standard of living. These are the kind of empirical questions that may very well prove in the end to be the most important in assessing the truth of Marxist communism.